There we go. It's coming back. Okay. I'll relax. All right. So somebody's going to tell us when we're ready to go. It's 5:30.
You've called to order. We are ready.
Oh, we are live now. I'm assuming are live. I haven't had anybody tell me that.
You are live. You are live. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call the the meeting tonight for April 23rd, 2020, a review of Clark Nuber and their audit report. I'd like to welcome our audience tonight, and just a point of information, Vice President Daniels will be tuning in about a half an hour. She had a conflict. I just got an email on that. And in addition, I just received an email from Director Bowen that she thought she was going to be on tonight. I called her earlier. She's been very ill, but she is not going to be with us tonight. So this is the group that we're going to go with. And I would first like to, I believe, turn this over to the Clark Nuber representative, and that would be Mike Nurse. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, go for it.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you guys for allowing us to do this and making it possible to do through Zoom, because we can't obviously do it live right now. This has been a really long process. We started this in the summer last year, and we now have new board members. So I just wanted to say, nice to meet you all, because we haven't actually met in person before. Feel free just to, like, if you have questions or anything at any time, just let me know and I will answer. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our team. We've got Mitch Hansen. He is a shareholder in the audit department at Clark Nuber. We have Grace Chu, and Grace is a manager in the accounting and consulting services department. And we have Isaac Prieto, who is an associate in the accounting and consulting services department.
Hello.
Before I get into the presentation, I want to give a really special shout out to the KSD team that we worked with, and especially Executive Director of Budget and Finance, Ben Rarick, and Director of Business Services, Tom Metcalf, and all of the operational administrative staff that we worked with have all been so great to work with and so willing to help us move along, and just have been really good sports about the whole thing. And I appreciate that. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Mike.
So today we're going to talk very, very quickly about kind of why we're doing this performance audit and what exactly did we look at. But then the meat of the presentation is all the observations. So we'll be looking at, if you've read the report, you've seen that we've broken out the report. All of our findings kind of fell into 4 different categories. And we've broken this slideshow out the same way. So procurement, bidding, and contracts, policies and procedures, documentation and access to records, human resource issues, and data mining.
May I ask a question here? Because that's
Sure.
what so I pulled up the original contract from September 2019, and in addition to reading the document. So I just, for clarity, you did hold an exit conference with management in February of this year? Okay. And who was in attendance? Was anyone from the board in attendance?
No one from the board was in attendance. It was Ben and Tom.
Okay. And so was additional testing considered or conducted after that February?
No, except that we found, I have just a couple of minor questions that I need to run by Tom and Ben tonight, or tomorrow rather.
Okay.
But nothing that I expect to change the report in any way.
Okay, so there were no substantial changes in the nature or revisions of the report?
Nope, not at all.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So as you all know, due to some public scrutiny around Kent School District and some year-over-year deficits, and people, as you know, in the public were saying, potential financial mismanagement at KSD, And so the board requested our services, and we were engaged to do a performance audit, a performance management audit, which I have a little definition down here because in this example, a performance management audit refers to an independent, objective examination and consulting activity designed to add value and improve the district's financial and contract administration operations. So that in a nutshell is kind of what we were going to do. And I'll tell you next what we looked at. So the big meat of the engagement was around policies and procedures and around contracting and procurement. That we looked at other stuff too, which we'll talk about, but those are kind of the two big buckets. And then we looked at information from fiscal years 2012 to 2013, all the way through to 2017, 2018. And we did the engagement in like a three-phase process. The very first phase was just information gathering and interviews. We came on site and interviewed a number of finance staff and procurement staff. We looked at existing policies and procedures. We got familiar with the RCWs and got that all in order. And then as soon as that happened, well, kind of simultaneously, we were helping the team to give them selections for our testing on the contracts. And so as soon as we gave them that, then they pulled all the information. And then it was a matter of them uploading information that we've requested and us reviewing it. And this is actually the part where Tom and Ben really, really helped because they set up a thing on Teams that made it very, very easy for us to transfer that information. It was great. So we looked at, as I said, the board policies and procedures around vendor selection, purchasing and contracts and bidding. And then we did some comparisons between the WSSDA, which gives out pronouncements related to changes in the RCWs and how board policies and procedures should be adjusted. And then we did testing procedures around capital expenditures, competitive bid procedures, bids and contracts, relations with vendors, architectural and engineering services. And then finally, we did some data mining with the procurement P-card information. So that's just a giant database of P-card transactions that we looked at to analyze it, basically, see if we saw anything. All right, so this on the left here, the orange is the total contract population that we had available to us. The blue represents the number of contracts that we tested. So you can see in all cases, and I actually have percentages if you're interested, but in all cases, it was at least above 20% of the population. And looking at total in terms of contract type, you can see here the difference between public works, furniture, equipment and supplies, and service and consulting across the years that we looked at. And then how we spent our time over the course of the engagement, the interview and information gathering was about 35% of our time. And the contract and data testing took about 45%. And the reporting and getting things all ready and kind of cleaned up took about the remainder of the 20% of time. And like I said, we started in in fall, late summer, early fall last year. And it feels really good to be at the end of this project and being able to share these results with you. Okay, so one of the main concerns that the board had when we first met with them was specifically around contracts and our contracts getting approved, our contracts running through the board. Is the board seeing every contract that comes through based on the thresholds that there are? And so that's really what this piece, this first observation, is about. So I will first start by saying, and this is actually one of our recommendations too, is that there wasn't really any system at Kent School District, no central repository of contracts. So it's not like we could say, here, pull us all the contracts that you did for this year. We had to actually go, with the help of Ben and Tom, get reports that showed all the POs over the course of those years and try and identify which contracts, which were the contracts, which weren't, and which POs belonged to which contract. And let's see. So
while you're stopped
yes.
right now, maybe it's a time for a question, because I was looking at the draft report.
Yes.
So with these cooperative and interagency transfers, you talk about the 15 out of 4. So was the 15, and then I did look at the charts you showed previously. I already saw that in the draft. So the 15 out of 4, is the 15, the total is 15 contracts, the total population around cooperative and interagency agreements?
Let me see what, are you referring to where we didn't see documentation for 4 of them?
Yes.
4 out of 15, you mean?
4 out of 15, you didn't see documentation for those cooperative and interagency agreements?
So those were selected. So the way that the engagement really was set up was not to look at these cooperative and interagency agreements necessarily. It was to look at contracts. And maybe I should explain just a little bit. So these cooperative and interagency agreements occur, and there's a mutual agreement. I think it's with the state or whoever they're doing this with. And there's a mutual agreement about a vendor that's going to be used, and about the services that are going to be used. And this is the core, really, of what we're talking about here, is that the language in the policies and procedures are extremely ambiguous as to the necessity for board approvals over future purchases from these cooperatives. So we pulled back and looked for the ultimate first cooperative interagency agreement. That's what that 15 refers to. Okay, those were the very first ones, because we wanted to go back and look and see, did these actually get signed by the board? If that makes any sense.
It makes sense. So, but there are potentially more than 15 existing cooperative and interagency agreements.
That is possible, yes.
Okay.
So, there was a lot that went through these kind of contracts. In fact, 77% of all of the contracts that we tested occurred through these type of agreements. And so basically, we feel that the policies around these types of agreements are unclear and should include some specific controls around the necessity for board approval. So some additional steps, because I think the staff has been working under the policy and completely here's what the policy says and what we understand the policy to mean. And that means we sign this cooperative agreement, and then we can make purchases under that agreement into the future. And that those purchases don't necessarily have to go through the total approval process, because it had already been approved with the original contract. So I think that cleaning up the language around those policies and procedures is really important. The other thing too is to just remind that keeping an eye on the budget is a really good thing as well as you move forward, as a board. And some things look weird, I would ask questions, and I'm hoping that some of the stuff will give you tools to be able to ask those types of questions if you come upon this in the future.
As I was going through this, that 77%, and I can't find it exactly on, I had marked, is a huge dollar amount, right?
Yes, it is.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, in fact.
It's something we really need to pay attention to, yeah. Yeah, I found it, it's like 26, no, wait a minute, 26,547,600 666 or 668. That's quite a bit of money that we really need to have a define. We need to get that really written correctly and easily and defined. Not that there's been anything horrible going on with, but that's a huge percentage, 77%. So we want to get that really done well. Yeah.
Yeah, and those percentages, that represents millions of dollars. So
Yeah. Yep.
you know, it's understandable that these would be passing under the board radar based on the existing policy. So this is basically a summary of what I was just talking about. The language in the policy is basically under the premise that future purchases don't need to go through the normal board approval process. And just to reinforce that, policy 6220P does set out expectations for board approval thresholds. And that's what we used for our testing, basically, for our thresholds. But that schedule says that it's for contracts not on a state of Washington contract or interagency agreement with the state of Washington. So that's where it's saying, here's our schedule, but it's not for these types of contracts.
So Mike, for clarification, we are talking about looking at the 6220P from 18 and backwards, not the revised. Okay.
Absolutely, yep.
Just want to make that clear.
Okay. Okay, are there any questions on that before I move on to number 2?
Is it standard practices when we use these agencies for buying through? Do most districts have in place a really defined, are we an anomaly that we haven't done that? I'm just curious. Or have it more defined like you had suggested, or is this just common practice?
So I don't actually know the answer if it's common throughout all school districts, but I can say that the board policies, which are the things that are put out by the WSSDA, it feels like you should be able to take those and put them into the district and be like, okay, follow these. And it leaves so much room for interpretation. They're not detailed enough. So what one district might be doing under this policy might be completely different than what another person is doing under the same policy just because of interpretation, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, those policies, the board policies are models. Like it's like a template, basically. It's here's the model that we want you to use, and go fill it in with whoever specifically fits into these roles or positions, or however you want to make it work.
Yeah, so even, with all these WASDA updates, and we paid for them to do a lot of them, and now we're going through individually to do our part on it. It takes a lot of work to get these things defined, and they're constantly changing them. It's a huge amount of work, but yet it's so critical for understanding and transparency and everybody to be on the same page. Not saying that the being a little ambiguous has been a problem, but I can see the importance of tightening all that up. Yep.
Okay, thank you. And I think we just talked about this. The original board approval documentation for 4 of the 15 that we selected, cooperative agreements, couldn't be located. And so we, of course, wanted to find out why. And so what is most likely the case is that these were old ones. They were before 2005, which is the year that these types of things stopped being stored in board docs, which is the online system. And so we asked a little bit more, and I feel like the board should request as best as possible a full list of all of these types of engagements, of these types of agreements, and to review them. And if there's something that's as old as 2005, and if you're still operating under that, you would have never known that, and unless it was something that you made it a point to look at. And it's not that these it's not that these agreements are a bad thing, but I think that if somebody's just not keeping their eye on the ball, then it can fall through.
So I do note that in your notes, you said that there was an attempt made to interview any employees who might have been there on staff for a specific situation that occurred in 17 and 18. Or I might wait because this is probably on the competitive bidding and process.
Yeah, that's coming up.
Oh, it's coming up. Okay, I'll wait. Because
no.
again, it deeply concerns my brain that, you know, we're operating under contracts that were signed in 2005 or earlier.
Mm.
And I'll be honest, this is something before I was elected and on the board, I asked a lot about seeing contracts and things like that. And there are, you know, I know, you know, President Hamada asked about the micro K-12 and the microcomputer systems, and I looked for an original contract on that and didn't find it. So as a citizen looking through, I would look through and try and find original contracts, and there were many I couldn't find when I was curious about a purchase.
We'll actually get into more detail about your observation there in just a few minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. So we'll move on here. So out of a total population of 106 contracts tested, we identified 2 exceptions to the formal competitive bid process. So meaning that it was purchased through a contract that didn't get board authorization. So the effect on that, you know, if that were to be selected by an audit, would be non-compliance with this competitive bid regulations as stated by the RCWs. But these are, well, at least this one is very old. And the staff wasn't quite sure. We couldn't get to an answer on why there was an exception on these. And the most common reason that we came across was that the folks who had made these purchases or these agreements didn't think that it was going to come over whatever the threshold was during that year. And of course, that's just speculating, but we didn't have anything to look at either. So, and the other good thing is it's not like it's a, you know, a recurring thing. It's just these 2 instances over, you know, all these years.
That's the one I was going to ask about. So it's like, you know, one of them is from 17, 18, and your report indicated there were no employees that still worked for the organization that could remember. In the 2013, the 12, 13, I could understand, but the 17, 18, that was just, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. So that concerned me that we don't have any employees on staff that would have been involved in that PO number 70518000196 with Duotech. So that really concerned me when I saw it in the report.
It's a decentralized contracting practice, I think, is part of the complication here. You've got contracting going on all throughout the district, not out of one contracting department for the entire district.
Mitch brings up an excellent point there. This goes back to not being able to pull a full list of contracts just at the push of a button, which it, you know, seems like you should be able to do that. You know, and there's possibilities, we don't know, we didn't see this, but there's possibilities that there's contracts being signed out at schools and not making it through the typical contracting process or making it through procurement. We just don't know that.
Which makes me even more nervous.
Well, I have to tell you, both Ben and Tom, in a couple of cases on these, have already started a system, an online system for tracking these things. So they're already on their way to fixing this.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they were on their way to fixing this issue even before we came in.
Okay.
So this is basically a recap of what I have been talking about policies and procedures being ambiguous and the Washington State School Directors Association being models rather than, this is the policy and you will follow these procedures. And so these ambiguities can lead, like I said, to inconsistencies in the way that job duties, authorizations, and responsibilities are carried out. And if it's not documented and monitored through these processes, then things can get missed. Are there any questions about that?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about grants here. And we only just touched grants a bit. We did talk to the grant administrator. And there are also program managers that initiate the grants. So in an ideal world, you always want to have your program expenditures accounted for and make sure they're allowable and fit within whatever the terms of the grant are. And so the program managers are checking for allowability of expenditures, but by the time that gets to the grant administrator, who's responsible for paying checks and things like this, she doesn't know that it's been reviewed. So the point of this is just to say that there needs to be sort of a trail between what the program managers are doing and whether or not expenditures are allowable and reasonable. And then that would give comfort to the grant administrator in paying those, if those have been reviewed. So there is an RCW 4223040, and it requires that municipal officers must not have a remote interest in any contract unless certain qualifications are met. So we talked to a few people about this, and nobody really knew, like, how do we even document this? It just seems so kind of abstract. And so we're recommending that KSD require the employees that are involved in procurement and purchasing disclose and document any remote interest that, this is an awkward sentence, that may be a remote interest under RWC with the numbers sections 1, 2, 3, 4, because it defines in those sections what are a remote interest. So they should be looking to see what these definitions of remote interest are and disclosing that. You're allowed to have a remote interest as long as it's been disclosed, and there's a few other rules that it needs approval by the board, and there's a few different steps that need to happen. But we feel that this should be sort of an ongoing thing when new vendors are brought in, to document that the folks who are working with these vendors or who solicited these vendors are not, don't have a relationship in them with them that would be considered inappropriate.
So I've worked for several publicly traded corporations, and this is an annual thing you have to report on. And I looked, this one really concerns me a lot, because this has been the idea of this concept, understanding this RCW has been one of the largest concerns with the citizens since probably late 2017, early 2018. So I just looked in policy, and it also this particular RCW is cross-referenced in 6210, purchasing and contracting, authorization and control, 1610, which is previously 1720, conflicts of interest, board and superintendent, 6230, purchasing and contracting, relations with vendors, and personnel policy 5211, assignment, reassignment, and transfer. So in this audit, did you review any of those policies as well?
I don't have the list of I'm sure that we touched a bunch of them. We can give you a list of all the policies that we looked at.
Okay. And
Go
then
ahead.
in this, because this is such a large portion of what has been the community concern,
Mhm.
did you interview board directors, the superintendent, the cabinet, executive directors regarding conflicts of interest?
I interviewed the board as far as conflicts of interest. I had a phone conversation with each member. Mind you that this was kind of right at that transition, so I'm not sure if I got everybody on the current board.
Okay,
But nobody was aware of any sort of inappropriate relationships.
okay. Because I know also I looked at the original contract, and one of the items that was specific in the contract is entity-wide controls and how we set the proper tone at the top. So I looked at the Appendix A too, and I didn't see, in the whole concept of this, I didn't see in that appendix that board or cabinet or superintendent or executive directors were interviewed. And on this specific item, it concerns me about fulfilling that portion of the contract. Some of the longstanding concerns with citizens is honorariums being paid and things like that. So did that come up in the requested scope of work?
In the
Honor-
interviews, go ahead.
Honorariums wouldn't be part of the contracting process. That would be paid through the disbursement process.
Oh, so, and you were not asked, so it would be honorariums potentially paid to staff.
Well, this was not a forensic audit. I mean, there's a distinction here. We asked for a
Oh,
performance management audit.
but I saw, okay, that goes back to something else. The scope of work was going to be a performance audit, a forensic audit, and a financial audit if needed.
Mhm.
So the forensic audit did not occur?
That's correct. So we do these things kind of in phases. So we wanted to complete, both us and you, the board, wanted to complete this phase of the engagement and see what happened and make
Okay,
a decision on that moving forward.
okay, all
And
right. Yeah, because there's some questionable contracts, like the AlloView contract has gone out with public record, and that's a specific contract that I know has come up as
Mhm.
a concern, with sole source purchasing, potential issues with the dates of being signed and situations like that. So I just wondered, especially since this is kind of the core of what the community has been upset about, that I just wanted to understand more deeply how this process was done. Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
You brought up a really good point right there at the beginning that I wanted to go back to, and that is the annual certifications. You have a decentralized contracting practice. You have folks all throughout the district doing contracting. Not only do you want a form that they would have to fill out if they did have a conflict to show that they could justify that it met these requirements. A best practice here is also to have an annual form where the people doing procurement would certify that they didn't have any conflicts during the year, or if they did, they brought them to the proper person's attention.
Right. So that would be something that even the board, everyone involved with the district would just naturally sign as an annual process. Yes?
Yes.
Everyone at all levels of the organization.
Yes.
So would you suggest when you have an election and a turnover that be done with the new board members in January or in the beginning of the school year?
It really depends on the organization and what timing you would feel most comfortable with. It's different from organization to organization.
Yeah, typically in the organizations where I've had to sign it, which have been about 3 organizations, it was upon hire, and then they had an annual renewal date every year for any current employees.
I've
So
experienced that.
sometimes people would sign it and then they'd have to sign it the next week just because of the process.
Mhm, mhm.
And
It's all
then,
about accountability.
Right. And then, you know, it's then also too, what I've seen before is where if there's going to be a contract discussed and someone does have one of those remote interests, there's another form you can do where you fill it out and you say engaged in this conversation, I'm disclosing, and it gets attached to the invoice or the PO or whatever.
Yep, that's right.
And did you, I don't recall exactly I read through the whole draft, but there's quite a bit to it. So did we have a process that somebody was going to be in charge of that from going forward to see that was done? Did you recommend that?
We didn't make any recommendations about sort of who should be doing the pieces around this, that, you know, implementing any of our suggestions. But you know, we're able to help with that process too, if you ever wanted. But we did not touch on that in this report.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, policies and procedures, observation 4, contracts and purchase orders did not or do not include verbiage regarding this RCW that you see, which prohibits a contractor's employee convicted of a crime against a child from working in a public school. So this doesn't mean that there's a bunch of evil people in the school or whatever, but there hasn't been like a consistent way to document that this is even being considered.
I am really concerned about this one too, because so this, in your professional opinion, should this also exist on contracts? We have a lot of contracted employees for specific services. Your professional, and should this also be on every contract, whether it's for goods, services, whoever's coming in to repair something, that type of thing? It should be on every contract, yes?
Yes, there should be some sort of boilerplate language.
So just out of curiosity, that's not in the contractors we're hiring, that doesn't fall under their liability to cover all that. It also falls under our liability to cover all that.
Well, the RCW requires that it's considered in any of your contractors and vendors.
What's your definition of considered? I'm just curious. I mean,
having them document and assert that they're not, you know, accused of these types of crimes.
President Hamada, it's kind of my concerns I've been raising about how some of our contracted employees have gone through the background check and things like that, and I still haven't seen anything to make me comfortable to understand how they're being vetted. And so again, this really worries me.
Okay.
Because ultimately, we, at some point, if anything occurs, we're the ones that they're going to come after for not due diligence, you know, so.
Mm-hmm.
Right, especially if you're not putting in that required language in your contracts. If you put that required language in your contract, at least they have made a legal assertion that they're complying with it. Whether they're lying or not, it's a different story.
I get it. I get it.
Thank you, Mitch.
It's just one more check. Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so next we're kind of hopping around here a little bit. We're coming back to the topic of grants. And there is yearly training is not being provided on uniform guidance regulations.
Those are the standardized grant administrative requirements for federal awards.
Yep, and those rules changed. And so there should be somebody with an eye on that to monitor for any new changes that come down the pipeline. And we did not note that there was any sort of documented procedure around that or any training.
Oh boy. So what is the risk to the organization because of this?
So these are the rules that you have to follow when administering federal awards.
Yep.
If you have people administering federal awards that don't know these requirements, the risk is you're not complying with those. I used to be a federal auditor, and I would go into an organization. The first thing I'd say is, show me your copy of the administrative requirements. And if they had a blank look on their face, I knew I should get comfortable because I was going to be there a while.
Yeah.
And that would always end up with them writing an IOU check back to the federal government for claiming costs that they couldn't support properly, or that are just blatantly unallowable, but they didn't know they were unallowable and billed them anyway. So it's important.
Financial risk. It's
It
big
is.
financial risk.
It is.
It is.
There was a school that I was working with where they had their entire school lunch funding cut off from
Wow.
USDA because they weren't
Wow.
following their federal grant requirements. And until they fixed that, they weren't getting any money for school lunch. So
Gosh.
it's important to stay on top of these things.
So this is a big deal.
It definitely can if the federal auditors come knocking. There's a risk.
Yeah. Any other questions on that?
No, now I'm even more concerned.
So this next one on policies and procedures, the current expenditure approval process, I think that when, I'm not completely clear on the sort of the staffing history, but I know that when there was a lot of, there was worry about financial mismanagement, there were a few processes that were put into place, and especially around authorization of payments. And so right as of now, the expenditure approval process requires 4 levels of authorization regardless of the purchase amount. So that can be burdensome and slow people down. And so inefficiencies basically is the word that I used. So
okay. But this was probably, if I'm guessing, the easiest and quickest and fastest thing to do to try and address some of those concerns, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very tight control because you've got so many eyes looking on it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got other mitigating controls in your procedures, then you can, ease back on this kind of stuff.
Okay.
So we interviewed a bunch of staff, and some of them said that they didn't feel like they were involved when there was WSDDA policies handed down to their job and department, that they didn't have any sort of say about their specific job duties and how that would fit into their processes, if that makes any sense.
Makes total sense. That's one thing that Vice President Daniels speaks about sometimes, is how the policies affect, because she works in a school district, how policies affect the workflow of employees.
Absolutely. Yep. So our recommendation really is to empower the staff to provide feedback and guidance. If you're, as you're developing new policies and procedures or new controls, it's really important to involve those people because they're really the front line, and they can be there and say, well, actually, this won't work. We have to do it this way, and give their input in that manner.
So what I hear you saying is a collaborative effort from the ground root up, and having everybody feel like they're part of the decision making. And even if it's kind of controversial, they'll have been heard and not just working under something that they didn't even have any input in, which I think makes it easier in any organization. Even though you may not agree with everything, it takes a longer process. But the collaboration of being included in hearing about that and having some input and some understanding. I just think what I've seen in a lot of areas is a lot of organizations or within the school district people, and I've been talking to a lot of different kind of organizations within that, we're working in too many of silos.
Mhm.
And this plays into that scenario too. I get it. Yeah. Thank you.
And that is not uncommon in organizations.
I know.
Yeah.
But it's one way to respect all employees to understand, what that is. So
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. All right. So we asked about sort of a business continuity plan, like risk assessment, kind of something that was documented, that here's the plan for if some major disaster happens, this is how we will carry on our business. And so we're just making the recommendation to consider that and consider the risks and to formalize what that continuity plan might look like.
and ironically, we're dealing with that right now. So
Yes.
I just want to clarify. So part of a business continuity plan is succession planning, document storage, remote work, etc. Right? Because the superintendent because I've asked about this stuff we had a meeting on the 19th of March, and I asked if we had a written succession plan. So you didn't find one in when you were doing the audit?
I didn't specifically ask for a succession plan.
Okay.
I specifically asked for business continuity.
Okay.
Okay. All right, monthly financial close. So currently the finance department does have a very old close checklist, which is great. I mean, it's a very good thing that they have it written down on how to do the different steps of the close. However, they're old and they're inefficient and they're slowing people down. This is kind of like the expenditure requirements, that there's places where it's probably not necessary that this manager needs to sign up on this or this. They can actually just sign up on that and we'll be good to go. And so this is part of that whole development of policy and procedure and trying to streamline this process so that it really works for this, with the way that the staff is structured, and considers, takes into thought what steps we're taking to approve this and why.
Yeah. So it kind of falls in line with the staff, like you said. So and in your professional opinion, are these streamlining this? Would it be a pretty simple process, or?
So the good news is that there's processes already in place. So they've got something to work off of. But typically what we would do is give a checklist. We have a closed checklist that just covers everything. I mean, it basically would cover everything for every business. And then you would just go out and cut the stuff that isn't needed. And so that's a great way to just see what the critical steps are in the process.
Right. Awesome.
Okay, we talked about this.
At this time, I just wanted to add something that reading through the draft, it looks like our finance department has implemented a lot of new things that I'm encouraged about that they're already taking on. So that looks, I just want to say some positive things about our staff that they're currently doing right now to take on. So I appreciate that. So
yeah, I was excited about it too. It's really good to see. I mean, the finance staff is really motivated they see these issues and, they're motivated to try and put some procedures in place to kind of control that. And they've taken the initiative to do that.
Yeah, I want to say that as a board and as staff, when we met first, Mike and Mitch, we made it very clear that we want to hear the good, the bad, the ugly. And I think, the fact that we're responding. I think that's the most important thing. We knew that there are going to be a lot of holes going in, but we wanted to hear what those were and what the next steps would be. So I appreciate you mentioning that, President.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we talked about this earlier, didn't mean to skip ahead so much, but it is really important to have sort of a central repository for both contracts and, as you'll see on the next slide, for grant documentation. It's important to so that people have the same place to kind of get the same information, because otherwise people are working with incomplete information, and that can cause a lot of problems. You know, there are softwares out there that do this kind of work, although I did say that Tom is, you know, as creative as he is developed this system to track all this stuff. And so he's already started that process.
I saw that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. And this next one is basically the same, central storage of grant documentation. The one thing that's a little different is that we didn't see a standardized checklist in the grant binders. So grant binders, when you get a grant, you should have a checklist that you develop that says this requires this, 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 and this. And then it goes into that grant binder, and then that gets filled out so that you know you're not missing anything.
Yep.
So there was nothing like that in the grant binders. That's not to say that they were wrong. It was just that, you know, it's just best practice to keep a checklist. So staying along the same line as grants, we noted that the source and the purpose of the funds aren't clearly documented during a grant application process. So this is important because potentially a grant could be coming from a controversial source, or it's a grant that doesn't align with the mission of the district. And so there needs to be some sort of review before a grant is accepted, that it meets the acceptable criteria. And that's what we're recommending here.
Would this also apply to, because the board gets things to sign off on donations and gifts of tangible goods and other things. So would you say this would also apply to that type of thing too?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
If somebody's trying to donate property to the district,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, you
Whole
don't want to
different
take on
ballgame.
you
Yeah.
don't want an underground storage tank or environmental issue, and so there's that type of transaction for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about different processes. Well, KSD and the finance department is primarily still on a paper-based system. So paper is going from here to there when it needs to get signed and slowing things down even more. It also raises the possibility that if there was some sort of disaster, that the paper files could be destroyed in that. And it also increases the risk for just basic mishandling, losing documents, not going to the right place and getting set aside. But what we would like to see you guys do is to digitize all the contract and procurement process, so that there's an easy way for authorizations to occur in real time. And they would sign off on this. They'd be able to see whatever the contract is, and then they could move forward rather than having to do it through a paper-based system.
And that also goes back to the business continuity planning.
Absolutely.
Mike, in that contract process that Tom's developing, the digital is being implemented.
Yep, it is. That's what he's working on, is that database. So yes, that piece of it would be digitized. So we talked to a number of staff who they feel like they're sort of stretched in their positions. Like there might not be enough staff. I don't know that this happened for sure, but I feel like there was maybe some layoffs or something and some positions didn't get refilled. And I think that employees are feeling a lot of stress around that and lack of resources. And especially when we're talking to them about this, like, oh, we got to talk about your procedure here and everything, that they say, okay, great. And now what do I do? You know, I don't have the resources to implement this kind of stuff. And so this is just a recommendation for consideration. And one way to do that, if you're thinking about like a department and you've got different job positions, you can put together a time control and you can track how much time it takes each person to do everything. And by doing that, you can either come to the conclusion that, yes, we do need more staff, or, oh, why is this person doing this and why is this person doing that? And you can make the necessary adjustments to free up those resources.
Probably would be good to do all over the organization. We've had a lot of turnover, as I have understand it, in central office. And sometimes what seems simple, like it doesn't take much time, actually takes a really long time to do. Did it come up in the audit at all when we talk about staffing and human resources that we have a written policy that requires us to have an internal auditor on staff?
We didn't ask that question, and I believe that there was an internal auditor at one point. I'm not totally sure about that, but I think there was at one point, but not now.
ASB auditor.
Okay. So is there anyone, when you were interviewing staff, that you feel is currently performing that function as part of their duties?
No, I mean, I think that that responsibility is so broad for Kent School District and in so many areas that, you know, people are doing it in pieces in their departments, but it's just not like a global thing. Like it would be, you know, a full-time position to have somebody doing that. You think, you know, you could have somebody, an internal auditor, going out to the individual schools and seeing,
Right.
you know, are they following these policies and procedures? Where
Right.
that's not possible right now.
And that position is supposed to be fairly independent from the hierarchy, so they can't be influenced. That's one of the benefits of having a separate independent auditor. You can control who they report to, and that gives them a little more latitude to get off into different areas of the organization.
And this was just a thing that we noticed, is we had asked about job titles and there was some confusion about what, like we talked to one person and we handed them their job description that had been given to us, but it was old, it was out of date. And so I think everything's updated now as far as job descriptions go. But the systems that should be talking to each other, for example, if somebody gets hired and gets a raise or something like that in human resources, that system should be able to talk to finance, so that same information, so that people are getting the same information in all the departments. Okay, so data mining is a process where we take output from an accounting system into an Excel spreadsheet, and we run it through different sort of analytical tests to look for red flags. And so one of the things that is a red flag is to see a vendor named cash, basically. So you'd be going through your disbursements log and see, here's a check written to cash. So we obviously asked about those, and those were related, they're old, they were like 2013 and 2014, and they were related to ASB events and needing cash for an ASB event, and that policy is no longer in place. They don't do any checks to cash anymore, and we didn't see any in the recent past either. So then we looked at disbursements that fell just under the formal bid procedure. The thought is somebody could slide on, $75,000 threshold, and they slide right under that limit so that they avoid having to get authorization on that. And so we looked at the different contracts that were falling below that and talked to management about that. And they were all deemed reasonable by management, in that they were all following policy and procedure at that time. And it also kind of depended on the type of service and type of agreement. Like something might be 2,000 below the limit, but that is what it is. That's just what that service costs. So it's not raising any alarm bells.
So I'm sorry, Mitch, you go.
The other risk is that they split a contract into two smaller contracts that are both under the threshold, but if they were combined into one, they would be over the threshold, and we didn't see anything like that.
Right.
So my question about that is subscriptions. So a lot of the digital learning or digital items you purchase, like Allaview, they are some things are on a subscription service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so my concern is in subscription services is when that might occur. So did you see any contracts that were subscription services with future amounts, anything like that?
In what we looked at, we didn't see anything subscription, but you bring up an important point. This is kind of like about like same thing as like retaining the or having the board look at the interlocal contracts, in that those things need to be evaluated. If something is being purchased and it's on a subscription basis, that needs to be evaluated and documented so that when it becomes time for that expenditure again, it can be authorized, it can be talked about. You can say, we don't need this anymore. It just is the opportunity for consideration.
We did sum all of the disbursements by vendor, looking at the number of checks to a vendor and the dollar amount to each vendor, and reviewed that with management. So those subscription services, you're right, they could be a small amount every month, but when you get to the end of the year, cha-ching. So we did come at it a little different way by summing all of your payments to vendors to see who are the big vendors you're paying, and do these amounts really make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So did you look at it over the course of the 6 years, or was
Yes.
it?
Mm-hmm.
So you would take a single vendor and add up all payments over 6 years?
We did it by year, but yes.
Oh, so you didn't do it. So you didn't say, okay, this vendor, Puget Sound Energy, which we have out here. So if you
Right.
Puget Sound Energy, and this is what we paid Puget Sound Energy in over 6 years.
Well, it was like basically, if you can imagine an Excel workbook. So we would have a year, and then we could sort and do whatever else we needed to do. So it was all that information was right there.
Okay.
I did look at the results from each year just to see how much are the top 10 vendors changing from year to year.
Yeah.
You should have a fair amount of consistency. There's certain ones that you would continually expect to be at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Mitch.
Mm-hmm.
So then we looked at tax IDs in the vendor file, or that contains some employee information. And we found vendors, this is like 2, that had different names, but they had the same tax ID. And so when we questioned them about, it was kind of obvious that it was a DBA, but we just wanted to make sure, and management verified that those were DBAs and considered reasonable. And a good recommendation to come out of that, though, it's kind of related to this, is upkeep on your vendor file and cleaning it up basically on a yearly basis so that the actual vendors that you're using are in there. Anybody who is not being used is deactivated for that time. And so, this just brings that to light basically.
So
Can you enlighten me as to how a vendor would have 2 different tax ID numbers?
Well, they have the same tax ID. They were
So
different names.
it's like micro K-12 and micro computer systems. They both, I think, have the same tax ID, but they're in contracts. They're both, or they've both, the board has approved things for both. So that raises another concern. So if you've got the same tax ID, but different names, did you then look at totals paid during the year to make
Well, it
sure
was
they?
Yeah, and it was only a couple of vendors that were involved, so it wasn't, there was nothing that was, sticking out to us.
Okay.
Well, excuse me, but I need clarification why a company, if they're the same tax ID, then why would they have two different company names? Because it's underneath the company, it's a different compartment, but one and the same, or?
Well, if you think about a contractor too, and if they're a sole proprietor, like let's say that I, Mike Nurse, mow lawns for a business. And so my tax ID would be the same for Mike Nurse, my social security number, and would also be the same for my mowing service. But on my W-2, it would say Mike Nurse with my tax ID doing business as Mike's Mowing Company, and then the same tax ID. Does that make sense?
Yes and no. I
That's-
mean, we're talking about companies. We're not talking about individuals.
So to take the company perspective here, suppose a company originally is created with the state corporations division as John's lawnmower business, and then a few years later they change their name to John's mower and tree service.
Right.
Two different names, same tax ID number. They've changed their name from what they were legally incorporated as, and those two names can be very different. And so when you first see it, you think, well, why do these two companies both have the same tax ID number? But they're the same organization. They've got a doing business as name, meaning they've had a name change sometime during their history.
And it's just a name change on, right? They didn't form a new corporation.
Right.
Did that answer your question, Leslie?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I've dealt with so many different things on that, but I've always had to, when I deviated with names or estate names or whatever, I've already had to go under different IDs. Maybe it's a different circumstance that I'm thinking of, or there's different parameters, but I'll figure it out. Okay, thank you.
All right. So this is sort of similar. When we were looking through the vendor files, we noticed that there was, and this is also only in a couple situations, that there was the same name. So Mike Nurse with one social security number and address, and then another Mike Nurse with a separate social security number and a different address. So how does that happen? So we asked about that, and it turned out that they were both familial relationships. So both were, in that case, were fathers and sons who lived in different places but had the exact same name.
Okay. They made me change mine. My social security card was under my name, whichever thing, but they made me, after 30 years, put my married name on it. So anyway, interesting. They were worried about me making these huge salaries, but it had to be correct. Whatever. I worked under my maiden name in the same social security for years, so I just found it interesting. That's all.
So the time
All
for
right.
questions. I have some questions too.
Yeah, that's it for how much longer do we have?
I don't know if we set a time, did we?
We scheduled till 7 o'clock. It's 6:39.
Got it.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Weiss.
So I wanted to, well, first of all, I thank you for all of the details and the recommendations and the time you've spent with staff, board. the community, I'm sure, as well. And I appreciate, all of the work gone into this report. And I wanted to just say that I have questions, but a lot of them were asked throughout the discussion. What I wanted to really talk about was, for me, one of the most important things, and we struggled. I don't know how many months we struggled on these bidding and contracting policies. And so I do see that you have gone through those and made some recommendations. And I just want to say I feel somewhat redeemed because I spent so much time, especially with the definitions of capital outlay and talking about how that could completely affect our staff and how they would actually make decisions to adhere to these policies because it's not understood. And so I do feel somewhat redeemed in that our current policies that we struggle to approve. It is clear that there are distinctions that we need to make. And so I just want to really thank you for that, because when I read that, I said, well, now I'm not crazy. That was my first thought. And it occurred to me that there are so many things that are involved with our contracting and bidding that our staff have to deal with. And especially when you talked about the grant administrator and that whole process. If that process is not laid out clearly, and if these policies are not explained properly, if a board member can't understand it, how can we then push this to our staff and tell them, like, hey, you need to follow this? So I struggled for many months on those policies because that capital outlay in particular, that definition clearly is very confusing, and we're not looking at federal versus state. So I want to really thank you for making those distinctions, and hopefully, we can incorporate that and help make sure staff understand that the distinctions, because there are conflicts within policies and procedures too that I noted, 6220 especially. So, regardless of the fact that we spend that much time and it's still having auditors point out that this is very confusing, it's good for us, it's good for us to hear the negative aspects of what went wrong. I don't think anyone is going to feel bad about this report. It's going to help us become much better as a district. And that's really what our intent was with the performance management audits. So, if we saw something completely out of the ordinary, red flags, we knew that we had the opportunity to go to the next step. And we may still, I don't know what board members are feeling. But at this point, for me to see those sort of process-oriented issues, and there are some serious concerns there too, with regards to our background checks and so forth that you point out. If you can kind of tell me from what you've seen, how much of the work, how much of the recommendations are already being implemented? I don't know how you can describe that in percentage, or what do you feel like that we have not had a start on that we need to get?
Good. Yep.
So the biggest thing that I noticed, and that I think is very important, is to get consistency in how people are doing their jobs. And so when we were, we have a policy and a procedure around a job, but it's not really specific to how this person should do this. And then if this happens, take this step. And if this happens, take this step. And then the next time the same thing happens, they follow that same exact thing and, same process. So it's kind of like a desk manual, if you've heard of that before. And so this was actually, I wanted to bring this up too, because when I brought this up to Ben and Tom, they for the finance department have already been working on specific procedures around jobs. Consistency really is what is the most important thing.
I appreciate that. I've been purposely quiet and want to thank, first of all, thank our board for their diligence. Thank Clark Nuber staff, Mike and Mitch, to be quite frank. I remember in previous board structure, part of the conversation I remember having, I've shared early and often that this is an accountability measure. It means that we are working to improve our processes, system structures, and that when, not if, something happens, we have to be able to take a close look, backwards design and map and see, is it a performance issue? Is it a process issue? Is it a policy issue? Or is it all three? And we can't know unless we have an independent set of eyes and ears, take a very close look at our processes, the way we do our business. Never have denied that we have many areas where we need to improve, and it showed up in some outcomes that we've improved as a result. And clearly, this document and this presentation shares with us we still have great work to do. But I go back to the initial recommendation. I stand on that, and I'm glad that we followed this process. It took us a little longer than we had planned, and that's okay. But we now have some clear guidance about next steps. To that most recent point, we have even taken a very close look at a book study called Checklist Manifesto that actually helped drive some of that process performance and making sure we've routinized some steps in our processes. So we're getting closer. I'm glad that we have this formal document to help us move this work forward. Thank you again.
Thank you.
For clarity, so on the forensic audit, is that something that the board would decide to proceed with, or, and then also the financial audit I see as an as needed. So is that something that I guess I want clarity on what the next step is regarding forensic audit? I didn't help prepare the scope of work, so maybe Director Vengadhasalam?
I don't quite understand. If there was something found that was of concern where you felt like there's fraud, then we would go into a forensic audit. That's my understanding. Mike, can you elaborate? Or
That's
Mike?
exactly right. And that was part of the purpose of this first engagement is if we see red flags and we pull the string and we go, what's this? And then if we suddenly discover, oh my gosh, this is a systemic issue, and then we have to determine, like, was money taken and how much money was taken, and quantify all of that. And that's what the forensic audit would do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So in your opinion, I guess that's what you're asking, Director Bellinger. Are you asking that?
I just didn't know. I mean, I looked at the scope of work. Like I said, I looked at the original scope of work, and I just, wanted to make certain that the entire scope had been accomplished.
The other part of that is, are there still concerns or risks that you feel need to be addressed as a group? And if so, we can put some meat on that and come up with some procedures to take a deeper dive into any of those areas.
Yeah.
After we've come out of this first phase, what questions still remain unanswered?
For me, I think, like I said, that AlloView contract and the micro K-12 microcomputer systems, that expenditure. So there just are certain one-offs, and that's why I was asking about, sample size and pulling samples and the sample criteria. But then I understood early on, I didn't ask about the criteria you used to pull samples, because I understood you couldn't accurately even find all the necessary samples, which
Right.
is another huge mind-blowing concern of mine. So that's where I am. There's just, I just want to make sure the constituents are being responded to. And, we were in financial crisis, and I don't think the community has seen, the reasons how we got into financial crisis and what was specifically done to get us out of that financial crisis. So I think that's something that is still just kind of hanging over this district as far as our constituents are concerned. And, it's so much that transparency helps every step of the way. And it's just so much that we can do to make sure that we're addressing constituent concerns and just putting an eye on things.
Well, we've reached about 10 minutes before 7, and I personally want to thank Mike, Mitch, Grace, and Isaac for all being here and all the work that you've done. And this conversation can continue, and you are going to follow up with the other couple things that you said that you had some questions on.
Yeah, it was just a couple small questions that I want an answer on. It's probably nothing. I mean, they're just small things.
Great.
Sure, appreciate that. And I think, again, we can set up a complete board discussion from our other 2 missing board directors, see how they feel about all this too. So I think at 6:51, unless somebody else has a pressing matter, that we're probably ready to complete and close the session. Do I hear anybody saying differently, or? Okay, well, I want to thank you again for being here, and all the directors.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. It was nice to meet all of you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Thank you for all your.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
And
bye-bye.
this session is closed. Thank you very
Thank
much.